Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call to order the first meeting of the Special Committee on Climate Change for 2020. Welcome today. I wonder if I can have a motion to adopt the agenda. So moved. Thank you, Minister. And with that, I will go right into our first guest. Dr. Kempton, welcome to the Legislative Assembly of PEI. We're so happy that you could be here today. And also thank you to Minister Myers for coming and listening to this presentation. I'm glad you could make it. It's your first time at the committee, so welcome. At that, I'll give the floor to you. I'll just ask if you could please introduce yourself for the record.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair. My name is Willett Kempton. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. I developed the concept of using electric vehicles for grid services and for storage for the grid in 1997, a long time ago, and have been working on developing and implementing that ever since, along with other areas of research in clean energy. So I was invited by the chair to speak today, and have had a chance to talk a little bit with some of the people in the electric sector, as well as in the legislature and the government. So I have a little bit of background, but I'll have to apologize. I'm not an expert on the electric system on PEI. Was that sufficient introduction? Did I forget anything?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Then I have a presentation, but I would seek your guidance on how to proceed. We can have questions during or before we start? Or?
It's entirely up to yourself. We often leave questions till the end, but if you find it more comfortable to field questions while we're going, I'm happy to facilitate that.
Okay. Because there may be questions along the way, I guess I would be open to that.
Fantastic.
The idea for using electric vehicles for grid support, grid services, is that EVs already have batteries and they already have chargers in them. The typical personal vehicle in the OECD countries, Europe, the United States, North America, is about 5%. So you purchase an expensive resource and it's used 5% of the time. With a gasoline or diesel vehicle, there's not much else you can do with it the remaining 95% of the time. But the argument for V2G is that an electric vehicle can be a valuable resource 95% of the time. You've paid for a big battery, and you paid for a connection to the grid, a charger. That can be a charger and discharger combined. And that can be something that provides value to the EV owner and to the electric system and to the jurisdiction in which it happens. So that's this second use of the car. The kind of most common way that I think that can be used is that there's somebody who's managing this and controlling it and making sure it's valuable to the grid, and also doesn't harm the use of the car as a transportation at all. They get some payment for their costs and maybe some profit, but then there's a payment to the EV owner, which means you can lower the total cost of ownership. There may be other reasons besides a payment. It makes it possible to have much higher amounts of renewable energy on the system. So someone might be motivated by environmental reasons or by civic, responsibility motivation, but it's easier if there's a payment as well as whatever other motivations there are. So on the grid side, this makes very low-cost storage available. You're not buying large batteries and large power electronics for charging and discharging. Instead, you're using something that's already there. You're adding a few $100s for controls and so forth in a production basis, not on a demo basis. You're adding a few $100s to make that a resource, instead of buying that resource for maybe, say, $10,000 for the equivalent of one car's worth of batteries and charging systems. You don't need that to get to the point where PEI is now, as well as a very few other jurisdictions in the world, like Denmark. So 50% renewables, that's working fine with no storage on island. But to get to higher levels, at some point you need storage, or at least it's probably more efficient, cost efficient as well as electrically efficient to have storage. So I think PEI right now is a good place to be considering this. So I'd like to, note that the committee's got very good timing and foresight on this. So the key concepts here, I mentioned the first one already. EVs already have the equipment you need. It's not just the battery, but it's also the conversion equipment. Most light vehicles are parked 95% of the time, and then to provide grid services, we may need to adjust those components a bit, but we're not buying huge new components. That means you might want to change the charger to be bidirectional rather than just charger is a charger and discharger. It's really mostly the same electronic components, but a little bit added. And you, of course, have to add controls so that you're being responsive to the grid. So you detect whether or not the grid needs energy or it's got too much energy. So that might mean looking at how much wind production there is, or the difference between wind production and solar production at load. But somehow, if the storage mechanism, again, whether it's a car or a bunch of batteries in a warehouse, the storage mechanism has to know when it needs to charge and when it needs to discharge. Otherwise, it is not of any value. So that's really quite different from wind and solar. Wind produces when it's windy, solar produces when the sun is shining. It's electricity. You try to use that whenever it's available. Sometimes there's too much and it has to be curtailed. But this is very different. It's the control that's essential to the value. We're not producing any net electricity here. We're not producing new kilowatt hours. We're just storing and discharging. Now, one vehicle is not really useful. You have to aggregate vehicles, and the aggregator needs to meet the trip needs of any individual. Again, purchased first for transportation, grid use is secondary. I bought this vehicle, it cost me, $30,000. I want to make sure I can use it for transportation. But if you're aggregating vehicles, it doesn't matter that I take an unexpected trip, because my 9,999 other, friends and fellow islanders are doing what they would usually do. Or some of them aren't doing what they would usually do, but enough of them are that there's still a resource. So if we had, say, a megawatt worth of electric vehicles set up like this, we might be willing to, we as the aggregator, the manager of this resource, might say, well, we're sure that we can give you 700 kilowatts at any time. I got a megawatt of vehicles, but I don't know exactly what each person's going to do. And in fact, when this has been done, and this is a running, market resource in some areas of the world, there's a bit of a de-rating that you do to be sure you've got enough. And you can tell after a while, we tend to have plenty in nighttime, and between this and that hour, we need to derate a bit. So this is something that you learn over time, but in the aggregate, it's very reliable, even though I may take an unexpected trip. The overall aggregate is very reliable. Law of large numbers.
And Dr. Kempton, to that point, if I may ask one quick question for you, could you give the committee an understanding of how many vehicles would be necessary to supply a megawatt worth of storage?
Well, we could say 10 kilowatts per vehicle, just as a rough number. A lot of chargers are 7. The J1772 standard, which is used for most light vehicles, allows up to just under 20 kilowatts. So 10's an easy number. So 1 megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. So you just divide. You would need 100 vehicles to provide a megawatt.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's, I think, around 40,000 vehicles on the island. So the idea here is that...
Just to follow on that, so to satisfy that law of large numbers, how many
well, we have
megawatts
some
would you
fleets
need?
operating that are 50 to 100, and they seem to be quite regular. But I don't have a derivation of that. It's experience.
But somewhere around the 50 to 100 megawatts?
No, 50 to 100 vehicles.
100 to 100 vehicles,
Yeah.
okay.
Now, if you need a
That's a
megawatt,
lot.
some markets say you have to have at least a megawatt you can participate. So
Okay.
I'd say then, if everyone is plugged in all the time, it'd be 100 vehicles. Maybe we should have 120 or 150 or something.
Great,
Look at the driving pattern and things like that. But it's those sort of numbers. Yeah.
great.
Thank you for the clarification.
So the idea here is, instead of cars and trucks being part of the CO2 problem. They are electrified. An area, province like PEI with 50% wind energy, just electrification of the fleet already reduces CO2 emissions a lot. The more electrification that occurs on the power side, the cleaner the vehicles get. And that's all good, but then if you also can use the vehicles for storage, it enables further electrification and less need to use fuel-burning power plants, whether they be on island or in New Brunswick. So you get these sort of multiple benefits. So from the user standpoint, is this going to be a problem from the user standpoint? What does the user see? So, sorry for the funny transitions here. You come back to your house, or maybe you have a workplace charger that does this, or ideally both. But you come back and you plug in. Your battery maybe is very low because you drove an unusual amount of distance. So in this schematic, it's showing it almost empty. So you plug in. We're not going to do any grid services when a car first plugs in with an almost empty battery. So this is in the Aggregator software. All of this is taken care of. So there's not some operator saying, Kempton just plugged in, he's almost empty. This is automated. So you plug in. First thing you do is charge the battery, but maybe not all the way up. So you charge it up based on the user's specification of, generally, I've got 200 kilometers on this EV. I want to have at least 100 all the time. And I'll tell you if I need more than that, let's say. So here we've charged up, say, 2/3 or 3/4 in this cartoon illustration. So that comes first, not grid services first. After that point, then we're prepared to do grid services. We maybe discharge a little bit, charge a little bit. In my hypothetical example, I've got 200 kilometers on my EV. It charges up to 150. I've told the system I always want to have at least 100, so I can go up and down from between 150 down to 100, 150 up to full, and all that moving back and forth is really valuable for balancing the grid. Yet it has no effect on my ability to drive, as long as I've correctly said I need to have at least 100. Now the system that we have set up, which is on a website and a mobile application, you can say, my typical drive, I need to have 100 all the time, but tomorrow at 7 in the morning, I'm going to drive onto the mainland. I want my full 200 kilometers. So then the system allows for that, figures out when to charge. It's got until tomorrow morning at 7 or whatever. And so it'll make sure that is charged up at that time. So from the driver's point of view, there's not very much to do. You don't tell it what to do each day. You don't worry about whether you're going to go on the market or not, or whether you're going to do it right now because the price is higher. Those things could be done, but we've tried to make it very simple for the driver. And what is the market model, the business model? I'll talk a little bit more about it, but this sort of schematic here just says maybe you make money by selling grid services, or maybe you're in a building where there's a demand charge or some other fee based on time of day, and so you may reduce the utility cost, you may not get a direct payment to the car. Those are different business models that could be applied. And even they could be, in different businesses that you're in when you plug in different places. So the idea is you're ready, you have enough to drive when you're next ready to drive. And here again, deliberately, we're not showing a full battery when the car is ready to drive. That's rarely needed. In the old days, when you would buy an electric vehicle with 60 or 70 kilometers of range, you might want to fill it every single day. But at this point, the new EVs that you get are really more for those less typical trips. So this is kind of the driver's perspective. Now, there may be some people who take random long trips at any time, some contractors, maybe physicians who do home visits, people who have kind of unexpected business calls far from their home location. They're not maybe good for this service. Maybe they want to just charge up all the time. We don't need every EV to participate. But I've used this myself for several years with a car, doing on the app and so forth, and I just didn't think about it. I plug in and, whenever I want to go somewhere, it's, half to 3/4 full. There is a risk you're going to take an unusual long trip tomorrow and you don't enter it. And so you look, when you're getting ready, and you say, oops, I forgot to put this trip in. So there's a possible inconvenience that could happen sometimes. For that purpose, the app also has a kind of charge as fast as possible button, but you may not be ready in time. So there's a potential inconvenience occasionally. So again, it's good to have a payment, so there's some compensation for the inconvenience of saying I need to take a long trip tomorrow, or sometimes forgetting. This management scheme will also prolong the battery life, because the most wear on the battery occurs when it's almost all the way full or almost all the way empty, and filling it to the top and leaving it fully charged overnight, say, is actually a significant source of wear. Now, when we have electric vehicles or laptop computers or cell phones, we usually charge them up full and just leave them that way. So that's not ideal for the battery. So when you put in these capabilities of managing to have the batteries charged sufficient for the next trip, you're also, just as a side effect, prolonging the life of the battery. Of course, there's also more cycling back and forth, so that's a slight reduction of the life of the battery. That's the user perspective. Any questions on the user perspective? Because that's one whole piece of the picture. Yes.
Minister Trivers?
Thanks, Chair. So on the compensation front, let's say you wanted to use it to offset peak times, right? So in the daytime, we got lots of solar energy and maybe more wind, we'll pretend. But at nighttime, the rates are higher. So that's when you want to use your vehicle, draw from the vehicles on the grid. Do you need additional infrastructure, smart meters and that kind of thing, smart grid technology to make that happen, or is that something you could do with the apps you're talking about?
So I said kind of two answers to that. We've tried to design the system so that it doesn't require large infrastructure changes. Right. So the services that I've talked about could be done with dumb meters.
Okay, good.
However, if you're trying to do time of day, like you just said,
yeah,
and you want that to be compensated through your utility bill,
yeah,
then you might want smart meters to be able to say,
right,
this car did more charging off-peak,
right,
and discharge, no charging, or maybe some discharging on peak. Right. So how are you going to tabulate that? Although there's a meter in the charging stations that we would recommend, it makes sense to have a smart meter so that your utility company, Maritime Electric or whatever, it's just automatically giving the customer credit for that.
right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mr. Trivers?
So it does make sense, and I could see how you would need smart meters for that.
Yep.
Can you give a couple of examples maybe of compensation models where you wouldn't need smart meters, or how that, just some real life, just walk us through it a bit? I know you mentioned
Yes.
some compensation examples, but.
So this is one of those cases the chair mentioned that I do have some stuff on that, but it may not completely answer the question you just asked. So
okay.
Let me go through that, and then
Sure.
I can refer to the examples and
Perfect.
answer your question more
Perfect.
fully.
Yeah, that's great.
But
Thank you.
please tell me if I haven't answered.
Okay, great.
Other questions at this point?
Minister Myers?
Thank you. I have one, and I don't know, maybe it's not an issue, but I'll ask it anyways. It's the charging and discharging of the battery over and over again, running through those cycles. Does it have a wear on the long-term life of the battery?
Yes. So again, sort of 2 or 3 part answer to the question. So definitely an issue. If you don't do anything else but just charge and discharge a lot versus only for driving, you'll have more wear on the battery. But like I mentioned, there's the most wear is when you're near the top and near the bottom.
Right.
So if you see the illustration here, we would be doing the charging and discharging from the middle. So we're going maybe 30% to 80% We're not going 50% to 100 or 0 to 50. So we can get the same amount of balancing ability with very little wear on the battery. And it's surprisingly different. Moving around in the middle, moving kilowatt hours around in the middle is some X amount of wear. Moving those kilowatt hours at the top might be 100 times that. So it's a huge increase. And that means, again, if you take your typical plug in my car, plug in my laptop, let it charge all the way up, maybe it's all the way charged by 9 p.m. It's sitting full the whole night until the next day. And maybe I don't use it, whether it's a laptop or a car, until the next day after. So that actually could be more wear than that additional cycling. The other way to answer your question is that if I invited OEMs to come to this hearing, which I can't, the chairperson can, and I said, what do you guys think? Do you want to do this with your cars or not? It'd be a strong majority vote, maybe 3/4 or more, would say, no, we don't want to do this. But the OEMs, the auto manufacturers that have studied it and looked at it, have, I think in every case, said, this is fine, this is not something we're worried about. And I'll list those later when I get to a later point. And feel free to revisit the question. But for example, Honda and Nissan, to a lesser extent BMW, have done studies of whether they're concerned about this, whether it affect the warranty, and they've decided no. Honda's published that in the open literature. Nissan is not, they consider that proprietary information, but they're warranting Leafs and ENV200s to use in this way, with certain restrictions, and no effect on the warranty at all.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
To you.
So that was the user view. Let's think about the grid view. Storage can balance second by second small fluctuations that can't be predicted. If we know ahead of time we're going to need more power, turn on another power plant. We now speaking as a utility or a grid operator. But some fluctuations can't be predicted, and so storage is really helpful for that. It's an extremely fast response, kind of second level response. And there are markets for that. So primary reserves in Europe, for example, frequency control in some countries, regulation in the parts of the US. And that's why storage is helpful for enabling high penetration of wind and solar. We're no longer so worried about fluctuations, fronts coming through at a time that's earlier or later than predicted. And as we've talked about, storage can also be useful for moving electricity from hours of excess to hours of shortage. Honorable Trevor's example, that's a very good use of storage. And a third is against unexpected accidents, loss of a power line, for example. So storage can be used to hold extra electricity in readiness to be released on a signal from the grid because there was an unexpected failure. So it's somewhat like balancing the second by second response, but you're mostly waiting and being ready. This is sometimes called capacity in terms of markets, or spinning reserves. It's for contingencies, it's not constant use. So this is sort of the way the grid thinks about storage as useful. So how do we build a V2G system? There's three components. There's the aggregation server, as mentioned that. It's in a central location. It's not necessarily, it doesn't have power flowing from all these cars through it. It's electronically connected through the internet. It's doing real-time operations. It gets signals when a car plugs in. It knows how much capacity there is. Is that car available for grid services now, or is it charging? I can't mess with it. And then based on the capacity, it offers a service to an electric grid entity, whether it's a distribution utility or a system operator or maybe a building. And then that electric grid entity dispatches. So it says, I want you to discharge right now. And the aggregator is responsible for taking that amount that it said it can do. The grid operator asks for a certain amount of charge or discharge, and then it distributes it out to all the cars depending on what each car can do. So that's a server running software. Then there's EV, of course, is essential here, and we have a control device we've developed we call the vehicle smart link. But the idea is that it's on the car, it controls charging, and it reports to the server. And of course, you need the charging station, formerly known as electric vehicle supply equipment, or EVSE. So that knows where it is on the grid. The car doesn't know where it is on the grid. The car drives around and plugs in a different place at different times. The EVSE always knows where it is on the grid, and that's essential, because sometimes you need power in one place and you've got too much power in another place. So the signal that it gets to charge or discharge might be different depending on where it is. It's also, the EVSE is also in many cases the entity that's registered with the power entity. So it'll say, here I can do whatever, 10 kilowatts of services. And it also, the way we would normally prefer to set it up, that's the internet portal. So you've probably got a router in the building these days, no matter what building it is. You just plug that charging station into the internet, and you have fast and free communication. The other way to do it is with cellular in the charging station, which has some advantages, but it's a little bit slower and you're paying a cellular charge. So either way, the EVSE we would see as normally the conduit to the aggregator, so it can report what it's able to do, and so it can be dispatched. So those are the three components. Nuvi is implementing these. It's a company which I have some interest in as a disclosure. And I advise them. They're using patents from the University of Delaware. There are other companies doing this too, but I think perhaps I'm biased, but I think they have the most complete version, and auto OEMs have told us that too. So they have an aggregation server. It calculates how much power is available, offers power bids to the transmission operator, the system operator, again, or the local utility, and then it dispatches vehicles as power adjustments are needed. So this is the process I was talking about. That's the sort of, I don't know what that color's called, pink, or there's some better word for it. Salmon, right, okay, thank you.
Atlantic going opposite.
Right, of course. So the aggregation server is talking to the power entity. It's also talking to the charging station, and through the charging station, it's talking to the car. So there's all that communication through the dotted lines, and then the solid lines are showing flow of power, actually. So there's no power flowing through the aggregation server, although it's controlling this storage resource. Power is flowing to and from the car and to and from the larger grid. So this is the components of a P2G system.
Stephen?
Professor Kempton, this graphic that you have up here, does this show any smart grid, any use of smart grid technologies in here, or is this?
No, because like I said, we can manage a storage resource and control it to the benefit of the grid without a smart grid.
Okay, but the IP communication with the Nuvi server and then offers power bids.
Right. So with that, yeah, that's using the charging station as just a conduit, passing an internet signal through to the car.
Okay. And how's?
It kind of looks like a meter. It's not the best charging station illustration, but that would be within a building that has 1 meter for the whole building.
And where's the communication? Like when it's offering a power bid and reconcile statements to the grid operator?
That's that red line on the right.
Yeah. What's happening there? It's communication.
Oh, so yeah. So okay. So for example, just to blend two of the system operators we're working with. There's a person, operating that aggregation server. They say, I think I can do 400 kilowatts tomorrow, pretty safely. I'm going to bid 400. So that might be something that happens once every 24 hours with a certain lead time required. The system operator accepts or rejects that. So that's a person maybe sending a spreadsheet out or filling in blanks in a bid form. That's electronically transmitted to the grid operator. And then the grid operator either accepts or rejects that bid.
Okay.
Because the cost of this is so low, in some jurisdictions it makes sense to bid no cost. zero cost. Here's whole deal, we'll give you 400 kilowatts, no cost. In certain bidding schemes, if you're the lowest, you'll get the same bid as the next lower bidder, if that makes sense. So somebody maybe charges, $30 a megawatt, and another person charges 45, and we bid zero. Well, we would get the 35. So getting into the weeds a bit on the bidding process, but there's that bidding process, and then once that's established, so we've committed to 400 kilowatts for tomorrow, and then the grid operator is now in control. We now give the grid operator control of our cars, basically. Not complete control, because the trips override what we're doing, but the grid operator now sends a signal that says, you said 400, I want 200 discharging. And then, maybe that happens for 5 minutes, and then they go back to zero. And then nothing for a half hour, say. And then all of a sudden, oh man, we got too much right now. Some big commercial user just dropped offline. So now we want you to charge at your full capability. We want you to charge at 400 kilowatts. So then we're doing that. So that line, it's a two-way line, because sometimes we're giving them capacity offers and prices, and then they're accepting bids, and then they're dispatching during the time we've bid. So what's actually operating now? What are commercial operations? In Denmark, for example, we've got multiple locations where these are, with lower left as a utility. It's got 10 Nissan ENV200s working from DC charging stations. The lower right is on the island of Bornholm, and it's a home healthcare service that drives out around. That's also an island. They're interconnected to Sweden, even though they're jurisdictionally part of Denmark. Upper left is also on the island of Bornholm. Then JC Decaux, which in many parts of the world maintains advertising posters in bus stops and other public locations. So their vehicles go out around Copenhagen, and they're doing the same thing with these DC chargers. So the charger is dispatching them when they're parked, and they have to be fully charged before they start driving, because they do have fairly long travel times. In the UK, this is at the Nissan Technical Center. Again, seeing the same configuration of Nissan vehicles and the DC chargers. Here in, let's see, this is in California on the left, and in Delaware with stationary storage. So we're aggregating some stationary storage as well. The buses are, the V2G is built in. Those are, forget the manufacturer now, but it's a manufacturer in Southern California. It just says very small batches. They're not a production bus operation. But this is BMW's. Sorry, some of the legends got moved around when we converted the slides over for this computer. But this is BMW Mini E's that they were already bidirectional charging systems. We just added our controls in the charging station. So you should see on the left the white units on the wall. And then we just plug in. The car just plugs in and goes. So there was really minimal extra cost needed for these vehicles. And you can see the cost difference between AC and DC charging. These are DC chargers at 10 kilowatts. They're kind of small refrigerator size. And on the wall here are AC chargers at 20 kilowatts. So it's twice the power and a tiny fraction of the weight and size and installation costs, because you just drill a couple holes in the wall and bolt it in. Yes.
Minister Trivers.
So those ones, the AC chargers, 20 watts, would they still be bidirectional?
Yeah. Right. In this case, it's the charging system in the car and the charger on the wall that are bidirectional. So you need for both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
A DC charger sort of just plugs right into the battery, So you have all the electronics in the DC charger, and so it's the charger that determines 90% of whether it can be bidirectional or not.
Right.
Minister Trivers.
So would the majority of EVs on the market, at least the car portion, have that bidirectional built in? No?
That's a barrier,
Okay.
to implementing.
Like I'm driving one of the government's Chevy Bolts, right?
Yeah.
I don't know, I didn't look at the owner's manual or anything.
Right.
Steve might know.
It does not, currently does not have that capability, right?
Okay. And can that be,
Mr.
oh,
Chair.
sorry, Chair. Can that be sort of retrofitted, like aftermarket sort of?
Can be, yes.
Okay.
Right. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but demonstration projects, I would argue, make sense to retrofit. We retrofitted these Mini E's, but it was a very simple retrofit.
Okay. Okay.
And there are some vehicles that have V2G capability from the start. So Lion Electric Bus, which is a Canadian, bus manufacturer.
Right.
They can provide, you can just say, I want an electric bus without V2G, or I want it with V2G. I'm not even sure there's any difference in price. It's just which charger they put on.
And Chair?
Minister Trivers.
Just, hopefully I'm not getting into too much detail, Chair. I'm sure you'll stop me if I am, but so the AC charger itself,
Yeah.
I mean, I just got one put in at home, it was about, less than $1,000 installed.
Yes.
But they're all not created equal either. I assume they're not all bi-directional.
That's right. And there's more signaling and safety issues and stuff.
Yeah.
So these chargers are $1,500 each. So it's
$1,500,
It's a small premium.
Okay,
But there is
okay.
premium, yeah. It's got communications, it's talking to the car more, and it's got safety features where it'll switch off if the car's doing something it's not supposed to.
Okay.
Minister Trivers.
One last thing, I guess, so I know it's become more and more popular to have solar arrays. I have one at home, actually, Steve's company put it in for me. Yeah, good. But if I wanted to just use straightforward my EV just to feed back into my home, would those bi-directional chargers allow you to do that, kind of?
If you've got
Typically.
solar in the house, you would.
Yeah, like, so the solar might come out to charge the car,
Right.
and like, let's say the power grid was down,
Yes.
it could, but you could feed back into your house, I guess is what I'm saying, through, like, a
Right,
little
so-
bit off-grid kind of
Right.
idea.
Yeah, so let me answer a question that you're not exactly asking, and then I'll answer the question.
Okay,
you're asking.
thank you.
So then, what you're not exactly asking is, suppose the grid stays on.
Yeah.
You've got solar doing one thing and the storage and the EV doing something else.
Yeah.
That works fine,
Great.
because, you're gradually through the day, you're starting to produce more and more energy,
Yeah.
and at some point, that's pushing out on the grid.
Grid, exactly.
The utility or system operator don't have any control over that. So they can look at the clock and is it cloudy and kind of guess how much they're getting. But the storage is still operating there, it's still useful, because if your car gets, or so it'd be the same if you got batteries in the basement, your storage unit is being told, right now I get a discharge. So that just adds, so there's still that delta. Or they might say, hey, middle of the day, I got too much solar in this part of the island, I want you to charge.
Right.
So that's still useful, even though you're pooled with, the solar. That all works fine.
Okay.
There's some additional safety requirements and sort of detection and so forth to be able to use your house solar and your EV battery as a separate microgrid that can be disconnected, which is more or less what you're asking.
Okay.
So I don't know somebody who's providing that right now. It
Okay.
definitely can be done,
Okay.
but I can't say these three companies, this will provide the EV, it does that, but it's definitely possible. And obviously, the reason you're asking the question, if you've got a source of electricity and a way of storing it, and you didn't have to buy all those batteries because you've already got them in your Bolt.
Exactly.
That's pretty sensible, but I don't know anybody who can deliver that product right now.
That was my question. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Ola.
Oh, thank you. I was just wondering, what kind of value is there in having your car battery hooked up? Like, is it 10 cents a day or $1 a day or something like that?
Yeah, so I have some examples, but I'll just give you a quick answer.
Yeah.
In the US and PJM, who are providing a system operator service, we were earning, these cars here were earning $1,200 per year per car. So you divide by month, it's
Yeah.
$100 a month. Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, that's total net gross revenue. So the aggregator put some work into doing things, and there's some little extra cost for the charging station. So there's people in business there who are going to want to get part of that $1,200.
Yeah.
But a reasonable model might be the car owner gets half of it, let's say. So $600 a year and that kind of service. So, and there's others lower and higher, and I'll give several different values when we get to that point.
Okay.
Steve?
Yeah, just a quick question. Yeah, you had mentioned a price for these chargers. What was 1,700?
1,500.
1,500? Just
US.
What would the price of just a regular charger be in comparison?
Well, Honorable Shriver's said, 1,000, I guess.
1,000 installed.
Yeah,
800.
installed, right. 800 for the charger versus 1,500.
Sure, thanks.
And in all these cases, those are smaller quantities, so that 1,500 is sort of 500 unit manufacturing, whereas the 800 are, they're making 5,000 at a time or something, so it's not exactly comparable.
Seeing no more questions, back to you, Dr. Kempton.
So just taking some other practical examples, this is actually testing at the National Renewable Energy Lab, where we're making sure that the school bus that I mentioned before, which has built-in V2G, meets all the electrical standards for safety and interconnection. The truck on the right by Transpower, this company I was trying to remember the name of, that's a charging system there you see labeled EPC Power, and it also runs the motor, so you can double up these functions to reduce the cost. But this a three-phase charging system. It runs the motor, it charges, and it discharges all in the same box there. And this is at about 100 kilowatts capability.
I see a question from Steve.
So, do I see a transfer truck up there?
Yes.
And that's got, thank you, Chair, that's got this V2G capability within it? What am I looking at there?
I believe so, yeah. So you can see, actually, it's the same power electronics unit in the inside of the hood of that truck that you see pictured close up below. That's being used in the bus, and they just made maybe 2 or 3 of those trucks to demonstrate the capability. Yeah.
Steve?
On the school bus note, do you have any rough idea what the size of how many kilowatt hours is in a school bus worth of battery?
Well, typical size would be 100 kilowatt hours, but the school district or the user would specify the range that they need.
Kind of 100 plus kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, might be lower if you have a really well-defined route and you're never going to need to go more than that. Sorry, miles in this case, 100, yeah. 100 plus kilowatt hours, sorry, that's the units, yeah, right.
Thank you.
So I seek some guidance on how much detail to get into here, but this page is running through the cost of AC charging, which is the lower cost of the two, choosing between DC and AC, and assuming the power conversion is on board the EV. And I guess I'm just going to sort of quickly give a couple of bottom line numbers. If you're looking at a demo, 300 unit cost, 15 kilowatt bidirectional, maybe $3,000 added per vehicle. Whereas a mass production by an OEM, an auto manufacturer, maybe they'd use 10 kilowatts rather than 15, and that might be at the level of $300 incremental cost per vehicle. Just ballpark numbers. If you did 50 instead of 300, maybe it'd be 5,000 or 6,000 per vehicle rather than 3,000. You could probably get it below 300. How you do it, it could be more than 300, 500 or something, but that's the kind of range. It's about a 10-to-1 difference. So demonstration projects are going to cost more. There's a little bit of cost also on the charging station side. So you can calculate that in terms of what's the capital cost of storage, so you can compare it to buying batteries and putting them in a warehouse and having them maintained and so forth. And you got to add customer support, instead of having one big warehouse and one manager you talk to who goes out and does things, you've got 1,000 customers, and sometimes they call and they say, hey, I'm not getting any V2G revenue, and you say, well, do you check is your car plugged in when your son comes home late at night? Is he always plugging it in? So there's customer service costs that has to be added to the distributed solution. Storage is expensive. Again, I won't go into the details unless someone is interested, but just looking at the capital cost of different kinds of more centralized battery system, looking at a range between 1,000 and 5,000 US dollars per kilowatt. And that's all costs. It's not just how much do the batteries cost. You have to have the power conversion, you got to have a grid connection, you got to have people managing it. So if you take that demo figure I just calculated quickly, and I'll leave the slides if somebody wants to look at them more carefully, demo may be $227 per kilowatt. So even a demo, which has this high cost, is way cheaper, and that's the greenish bar there. Even a demo is way cheaper than buying batteries and putting them in a storage system. And if you go look at the mass-produced cars and so forth, OEM production, I gave the total number of dollars. We're like maybe at 10 or 15 kilowatts, so dollars per kilowatt, way cheaper. So this is, in a sense, the primary motivation. We're going to need storage in the future. There's going to be more fluctuating renewable electricity. How do we get that storage? Well, we can build big batteries, and we'll be doing some of that. That's part of the picture. But we want to tap this really low-cost resource. So revenue.
Minister Trivers?
Thank you for that, and I know you're looking at, the utility scale storage there.
That's right.
I mean, one of the big names, or the hot name, is the Tesla Powerwall.
Right.
That would be one of the more distributed ones.
Yes.
And I'm thinking it's probably in the $350 US per kilowatt. Is that, would that serve a similar purpose?
Yeah.
Compared to an EV, or can you compare the two, kind of?
You can compare, because it is distributed.
Yeah.
It's in a residence behind a residential meter, so it's very comparable. Now, I'm using Lazard here, which is a definitive resource on cost. And they're showing the very bottom thing here is a residential, well, here it's PV plus storage, so it's not completely comparable. But they're showing high costs, which makes sense because you're going out and installing it one at a time, whereas the utility scale ones are more at the top here, the darker blue. Those are lower, but not all the way down in the scale, because you're installing, instead of going out to each house, you're adding 10 kilowatt hours in each house. You're going through a commercial operation, installing in this rack and that rack and that rack. So the Powerwall is more expensive. Now, as far as the calculation of that, I can't vouch for those numbers, but Lazard's storage report is considered to be a definitive report on cost.
Okay. No, thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Ola?
Yeah, I was wondering if the system can be used to regulate demand meters, like in the commercial buildings, where typically you pay for peak loads. Could it be used locally like that?
Definitely, yes.
Yeah.
So that could be the only use. So you could just say, when cars are plugged into my commercial building, maybe it's an employer, and the employer might say, you have to pay for charging, but if you let me use this to reduce my peak load, then you can get some charging for free. Just as one example.
Like whenever somebody uses the elevator, you draw on the battery so you don't get a peak load.
Or the chillers or whatever, right, yeah.
So the other question was, like in this province, we pay the same electricity, and I think even the province gets the same price for the electricity whenever it comes out. But obviously somebody in New Brunswick, turns things on and on. So my question is, would it still work for PEI to have a battery as long as they're connected via the internet with the operator in New Brunswick? Because we're obviously connected by the net already, so the electricity knows where to go. But,
I don't know all the details of the pricing. My impression was that New Brunswick Electric is charging the same amount, as you say, at different times of day. In that case, there would be no financial incentive to use it in that way, not to use the batteries to reduce their need for peak.
Yeah, but
Is that your question?
Well, as I understand it, isn't just like the peak which occurs at a certain time of day, but it's also like at any given moment, any minute.
Yes.
Like the operator has, either it turns on a 10 megawatt diesel generator, or you could draw it from a battery.
Yes, that's
does that
right.
kind of thing take place?
I think I understand your question, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong. But for example, Maritime Electric has some generators that it uses essentially in emergencies. So this kind of system, and you're not going to do it with 1,000 cars, you're going to need a lot more than that, but there's 40,000 on the island or something. So if you had this capacity, you'd be able to, Maritime Electric would be able to toggle the cars to, we need peak right now, we don't have enough, or maybe one connector's gone down to New Brunswick. We need to discharge the cars. They discharge and then you don't have to turn on the generator that day.
Okay, thank you.
So that definitely could be useful. But the other possibility is because New Brunswick is going to start charging for balancing services. And that's an ongoing charge for new wind. That's, I think, $15 per megawatt hour of wind production. So that's a, whatever, 30 to 50% increase on the cost of new wind production. So these batteries could be used for that purpose, but then they would be used on more of a continuous basis, which I suspect would produce much more revenue.
Sunny?
I think you might have answered my question about the discharge, but I was sitting here about thinking charging and discharging.
Yes.
So we all in this room have an electric car.
Great.
And you say...
I do too.
Well, I wish I did, and you say that Maritime Electric might need some electricity. So
Yep.
we can plug in our cars and discharge into the grid to supply that demand for them.
Yes.
What does that do to the battery where you indicated your highs and lows? Like, are we going to deplete our battery, or are we just going to, is there a
So
stop
the
mechanism?
little cartoons showing the user plugs in, they're empty in the beginning. It just charges up initially. It doesn't do any services when the battery's low. So there's a priority for driving. That's what the person bought the car for. That always has to have priority. No matter how much, Maritime Electric or the New Brunswick system operator needs it, that's going to get ignored if you don't have enough for your next trip. So yes, it would reduce what's in your battery, but because, this is assuming the aggregator is done in the correct way, which, the one we wrote is, and the way Newby's now redoing is, it would not affect your driving as long as you've correctly indicated your driving. Like you have two controls. You have a control that says, never go below, and my example is 100 kilometers. Very rarely do you ever drive over 100 kilometers in your EV. I don't know how big your battery is, but nowadays they're probably at least 200 kilometers. So you tell it, never go below 100, it will never do that, no matter how much the power entity needs the power. You go down maybe to 101 and stop. The other control that you would have as a user, as a driver, is you can say, tomorrow I'm going to make an unusually long trip. I need to be ready to go at 7 a.m. and I need my full 200 kilometers of charge because I'm going on to the mainland or whatever. Again, that gets first priority. So the system is looking and saying, can I make some money? I'm doing balancing, but now it's 3 a.m. and I know the size of the charger you've got. I know how long it's going to take to charge up. I got to stop doing grid services now and just charge at full speed so I'm ready to go at 7 when you're ready to leave. Okay. So that's all automated. That's all at sort of lower, highest priority level. So the first level answer to your question is no, it won't impact your driving. Okay. But the second level is if you forget to enter that trip tomorrow, you might see, hey, it's just got my usual 100 kilometers. I needed 200. Oops, I forgot to enter it. So, it might be inconvenienced a couple of times.
Okay. So if I did have an electric car and I wanted to put it on that and I wanted to let it go into the grid, did I hear you say, like, is there a number that it would stop at, so certainly it doesn't totally deplete my battery? So
that's right.
Then in a year and a half I have to replace the battery because of
sorry,
on the
deplete
battery?
in the sense of wear out the batteries.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you meant deplete, like you wouldn't have enough for your
No,
next
because
trip.
that might be a deterrent for people who want to put anything back into the grid, right?
Right.
To replace their battery.
There is some additional wear from the additional cycling, but because we avoid the high wear areas of the curve, we don't go all the way up very often. We don't go all the way down whenever, if we can help it. We never do that. That lengthens the life of the batteries. So there's a trade-off. Is there more moving back and forth, so you get more wear than savings, or by avoiding the ends of the band, you actually prolong the life of the batteries. There have, in a sense, don't believe me because I'm just some, academic researcher, believe the auto manufacturers. So Nissan has studied this very carefully. They give a full battery warranty on their cars when they're being used for V2G. Nissan Europe has decided that's what they're going to do. You can, anywhere in Europe, you can buy a Nissan Leaf or a Nissan Truck ENV200. You can use it for V2G for the whole life of the vehicle, and your warranty is exactly the same. So they're putting real money on the table to decide that and to offer that. Honda has done studies of this and has published a paper where they say the additional wear from V2G is measurable, but it's negligible in terms of our business. So they have chosen, they could say, hey, you're only going to get a 7-year, 9-month warranty instead of an 8-year warranty. They might be justified in doing that, but it's like they say, this is not even anything that's going to have any effect. So those Honda vehicles are in prototype. They're not available for sale yet, but they'll have built-in V2G, and the warranty, if we can believe what they've done so far, will not be affected. So there's 2 ways to answer. Data-based, what I've seen, what other researchers have seen, it may have a small effect. That effect may be balanced by other savings in the battery life. And looking at the OEMs, the ones that have studied it are saying this is not a problem. And they're putting their warranty money on the table for that. The ones who haven't studied it, like I said, I got a bunch of auto manufacturers in the room here. The majority would say, no, we don't want to do that because it's going to wear out our batteries. So if you talk to a lot of OEMs, the majority will probably tell you, yes, it's going to wear out the battery, and that's why we're not doing it. The ones who offer this as a feature of their cars are going to say, we looked into it, this is fine.
Okay. Thank you.
No questions at the time.
So, example revenue, we touched on this briefly. PJM regulation, it's a system operator service, 1,200 US per EV per year if it's consistently plugged in. This Denmark fleet of utility vehicles, for example, primary reserves market, earning 1,600 euro per EV per year, and only selling during off-work hours. So when those vehicles are in use Monday through Friday, I think it's 7 to 3 or 7 to 4, they're not even on the market. So that's a very nice payment. And then, if you're just doing balancing peak, on peak, off peak, it might be more like $50 to $200 a year, depending on the jurisdiction. So you need to understand the market to understand the business model. And you can decide, just looking at the value, you can decide purely on a business decision. Does the value exceed the cost? Or you might decide, this is something we want to do because we want more renewable energy, so we need storage. This is the least cost storage. So you don't necessarily have to look only at the revenue, but as a business decision, the revenue is variable depending on which markets you're on.
Question from Steve Howard.
Chair. So this example of $1,200 per EV per year is what size battery are we looking at in a vehicle like that?
That was a 30 kilowatt hour battery and a 19 kilowatt bidirectional charging system. So the revenue is more directly proportional to the charge rate in kilowatts than it is to the battery size.
It depends, balancing.
Right, for balancing, that's
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Fair enough. So on a larger vehicle, say like a bus, you'd have a much larger charger, I would assume. And would your revenue just go up proportional to the size of your
Yeah,
charger?
so it varies tremendously. Like right now, there's bus companies that are putting, 10 kilowatt chargers on a bus because they say, we've got all night. The others are doing 50 kilowatt. We're trying to provide a 100 kilowatt unit. The bus that you saw is a 70 kilowatt.
So those would be 5 times that, because they're 5 times the size of the charger that revenues would come in.
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty significant amount of money.
Yeah, so if you were making a decision on, say, buying a diesel bus versus an electric bus, and you were trying to build a business case for it, you'd have to factor these kinds of things in if we had...
Right, and you would care about what the charge rate is.
Thank you.
Because just knowing it's a bus, you don't know whether they're on the 10 kilowatt side or the 50 plus kilowatt side, right?
That's good.
Yeah, so 100 kilowatt charge rate on a bus would be 10 times that number, which is, sorry, 5 times that number, which is based on a 20 kilowatt charger. That's a tough number.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So, I mean, this is going to have a certain payback to it, right? At
Sure.
some point, you're going to recover all the extra costs that you put out there.
Yeah, right now electric buses are expensive, so you'd have to say there's some societal benefit or some getting ready for these to be cheaper benefit. But, yeah, this is going to affect the overall economics.
For sure, yeah. But would it become a revenue, like a net positive at some point? You're going to have a payback point.
I think I'd have to say if you look at the current cost of an electric school bus, because again, the incremental cost of putting V2G on it, we're being told is very little or say zero in the cost. But an electric school bus has a pretty significant incremental cost. So I'm not sure that would pay off, despite how big that number is. So you'd have to look at the particulars.
Okay.
School buses are kind of expensive to start with, but electric, you're adding a lot of batteries and things. These are small production runs mostly. So you'd have to look at the particulars.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So something else that would help with that payback is if you had some carbon pricing in place to compare so that the non-clean option and the clean option were operating on.
Right, carbon pricing, or if you took account of the health impact of diesel.
Yes, that as well.
Because there's actually a pretty significant cost in health of the children riding the bus and those in the vicinity from running diesel buses. One of my PhD students did an economic analysis. Nobody cares about that when they're buying school buses, but I think they should, Of course, that accounting goes on somebody else's ledger, the health insurance or the
That's right.
national government or whatever.
Chair.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So are you aware of the carbon pricing that we have in place here on Prince Edward Island?
I know that it's there, but I don't know much about it, so.
We collect.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. We collect it, then we rebate it back in gasoline tax. So we lower the price of gas with our price we collect on gas. So it kind of removes all the incentive. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts. Does that encourage any sort of transition to these types of clean technologies? Or
I think you're getting a little outside of my expertise, and I don't know the particulars of pricing here, so I wouldn't want to comment on that. I think I'm here as an expert, and so I couldn't really say. I'd have to know a lot more about how that works.
Thank you. Minister Trivers?
Well, thank you, Chair, and I put on my other hat as Minister of Education and Lifelong Learning.
Okay.
And definitely interested in that study that you mentioned about the impact of diesel on health, and so I'll contact afterwards if you're willing to.
Sure,
If your
please.
PhD student's willing to share that, I'd be really interested.
It's a published study, so I've considered it.
Fantastic.
No problem.
Thank you, Chair.
If it's the interest of the committee, we could request that you forward that along to us at the end.
Sure, to the committee, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Minister. Any further questions before we allow our guest to continue? The floor is yours, Dr. Kempton.
Thank you. So PJM, Denmark, this is looking at this is the market, sorry to repeat. What is the market? Is it going to pay for itself or not? It depends on all the things here, plus the cost of the vehicle and things like that. So since there is a revenue stream, we can talk about the business model. I guess I should ask the chair, how are we doing on time? Should I try to speed up or?
I think we are still fairly well
Okay.
positioned for
Okay.
the amount of time that we have.
Maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through
That's
here.
fantastic. Please continue.
Okay, so since there is a revenue, we can ask, is there a business model here? Does this pay for itself? And the kind of short summary answer is, initially for demonstration projects, it's not going to pay for itself. Maybe early school bus, for example, may not pay for itself. But in a production basis, it easily pays for itself, is the short answer to this. So who are the business entities? There's the kind of the owner of the generation, the owner of the storage resource. It's flipped around. It's the person at the far side of the electric grid, right? It's the car in the driveway of the individual farm, That's the supplier here. And they own the resource. The resource is the EV and the grid connection and the parking space. That parking space has value. Well, they already bought all those things for some other purpose. They have some incremental cost to make it work for V2G. And they pay for the energy to drive, Plus, in this back and forth, there may be some losses. So they are paying for that too. That's kind of a hidden cost, but you have to make sure that there's a fair transaction for the owner of the resource, because there is some losses back and forth. We want to minimize those in the technical level. So they receive compensation for providing grid services. At least in the business models I would advocate. You could do it a different way. You could require it or whatever. But they should get paid for grid services, and those payments are much more than the cost and losses. And then how do you value that one time you wanted to take a long trip and the car wasn't ready because you forgot to enter? There's a cost there. So are they fully compensated? That's at some level up to the customer. But you want to make sure they're getting paid so that all of those different things are compensated. The other entity here is the aggregator. They're not ultimately using this service. They're an intermediary. They're managing a fleet of cars. They're making sure the charging stations and cars are compatible. They're probably getting the customer, that is the supplier here, the individual car owner or the fleet owner. They're getting them to sign a contract agreeing to be able to do this and having some specifications and some guarantee of this and that. So the aggregator signs the contract, and they're responsible for customer complaints. So they have to have an 800 number or some way of answering queries. They may pay for the incremental costs. So maybe the customer paid a little bit extra for the car. They paid a little extra for the charging station. There had to be a little bit different installation maybe. There had to be an internet connection. They had to upgrade the router. So it's maybe the aggregator pays for these incremental costs. And importantly, the aggregator operates the dispatch of the vehicles. They have complex software system. There's an operator there probably 24/7. They're looking at what's going on. There's a person who's answering phone calls who comes in and says, what's going on? Everybody on the west end of the island says they're not getting enough charging. Hopefully that never happens, but there's got to be a way for all of that kind of feedback to go into a real-time operator. And that person or a business person working with them is then selling the grid services to an EDC, electricity distribution company, that is utility or system operator. Somebody has to see value here, if it's a business model, and so they're selling that value. They're saying, here's how much I can provide to you for the next 24 hours. And then, I don't have a bullet here for it, but they're also responsible for dispatching. So they've sold this capacity, and now the system operator or the utility is saying, we need more now, we need less now. They're responsible for making sure that's working correctly. This is one business model, there are others possible. But this is a way of taking that revenue, that value, and distributing it up to pay for this aggregator and then to pay the supplier of the storage, ultimately. It's the person who owns the car. Now, the other entity in the business model is the buyer, the user of these grid services. So they may be bidding. They may say, we want a megawatt or we want 100 megawatts, and here's what we're willing to pay. Or everybody bid and we'll take the lowest cost. So they're ultimately the user, and they care about where the electrons flow and how it interacts with their system. And the other business transaction here is that the customer, the supplier of storage, is paying for the energy that they've consumed, whether it's to drive or to there's some losses in the grid services. So the EDC is getting paid by the customer. When you add an electric vehicle, you're paying the utility more because you're using more electricity. And that might be a third more than your kind of typical residential bill, just say roughly. So, of course, it's much less expensive than gasoline or diesel. So you're saving on that. You're paying something for driving. But if you're doing storage operations, there's a little bit of loss, so you're paying a little bit extra to the utility. So the utility is getting paid for all this. It's not like solar, where although solar is generating new energy, which this isn't, solar is asking the utility to pay for it. Whereas here, you're actually the car owner, the supplier of storage is paying more to the utility. So you have to make sure you're getting more benefit than you're paying. So these are the business entities in the business model. Ways to improve the economics, better markets I mentioned before, onboard charger with communications and AC connection, substantially lower cost than DC. Sometimes it's easier to get DC interconnected, licensed.
Before you go further, I see a question from Minister Churgers.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Apologize.
Well, thanks, Chair, and bear with me. I'm just trying to understand your last slide. So, for example, here on PEI, let's say it's, we're paying, I'll say 13 cents per kilowatt hour. And right now, it's just, that's the rate. There's no tiered rate.
As a residential customer.
As a residential customer. So that's what I'm paying to put the electricity into the battery on my vehicle, because I'm connected to the grid, I'm charging it up. But our electricity utility, Maritime Electric, is purchasing, it's generating power on island, but it's also purchasing from off island, and they have an agreement with New Brunswick Power. So what you're saying is during times when they're paying more than 13 cents per kilowatt hour for the electricity they're providing, they would choose to take it from my battery, potentially. And that difference, let's say they're paying 18 cents per kilowatt hour at that time when, you know, they have to go way over their agreement limits. So there's that, 5 cents per kilowatt hour difference.
Yes.
And they might choose to pay part of that back to the owner of the electric vehicle for the energy they're buying. Is that
Right,
what
so
you
that would be one business model, where the
Okay.
utility has a cost, you're a supplier now. You know, New Brunswick can supply power, they can crank up their generator, or they can ask you to
Right.
discharge your battery. Of course, it's not just you, it's a bunch of people through an aggregator or whatever. Because you can't guarantee you'll be there, you might need to go to
No.
the store in an hour. But the aggregator can guarantee they'll have a certain amount. So, but just for simplicity, we can talk about you. Yes, they would pay you that difference.
Right.
And so you would get, you'd get paid more. When you sell it to them, you're getting paid more than when you bought it from them.
Right.
So that's the sort of transaction benefit.
And that's the key point, I think.
Yeah.
I would have to get paid more than I bought it from, otherwise it
Sure.
would be, it's not
Yes.
worth my while.
Of course.
Okay.
Right.
Would that ever be the case, though?
Well, I don't know, we have the Minister of TIE here, I don't know if he knows that off the top of his head. I don't know how much we buy power for from New Brunswick would ever go above that residential cost of 13 or 14 cents a kilowatt hour, but I don't know.
Would you like to weigh in, Minister?
I believe I will.
You don't have to.
I will, so you're basically asking, would we buy higher than what we're selling it for? Or Maritime Electric would? I don't think that's the case. I think they have a constant rate on it, but I think where the issue is when we produce our own power, it's the load balancing. So I see where this is going to help our load balancing, where we're bringing on a 30 megawatt wind farm. The issue that we have is the load balancing fees are killing us. So it's hard to pass the savings on to islanders, because until we can store our power effectively, and this is an option, and with your help through school buses, we might be able to get some big batteries in quickly. So I don't know. I think it's a really good option. I'm quite interested in how this can help solve a problem for us. But the problem is one that we create ourselves. It's not necessarily a problem with the power we purchase from New Brunswick, as I understand it, and I'm not an energy expert.
Okay.
And if I could just ask for one point of clarity, the point that the minister is making, would that still be a possibility with a dumb meter to provide a different rate of pay depending on the production rate?
So that's a really great question. So just to take the Minister of Energy and Infrastructure's point, if it's a system balancing service, that could be done with the meter in the charging station. It wouldn't need a smart meter. But if it's a retail transaction where you're saying, you want to be paid more when you discharge, otherwise why would you do it? Theoretically, that could be done with a meter in the charging station, but it's probably much more practical to do it with a smart meter that's measuring not only whether you're going in or out, but also what time you're doing that. So that's a great example. That one service you wouldn't need smart meters, the other service you would.
Thank you. Questions? Ola?
So I think it would be great to have such a system. It would be, as far as I can figure out, roughly $5,000
For demonstration.
Over a 10-year
Oh,
period.
right, yes.
Over a 10-year period or something
Yes.
in that range,
Yes.
which would be a significant additional subsidy for electric cars. But I was wondering, what kind of conditions do you need locally for somebody to step in, whether it's the utility or the province, to make this happen? Do you need, what
Yes.
kind of density of cars do you need? I mean, I assume we don't have enough cars. How many cars do we have in the province? 20 maybe? Probably wouldn't do it.
I heard it was 45.
Or maybe it's 45, yeah. Not a lot, but
Yeah. But those cars aren't really ready to do V to G anyway.
no.
So you'd want to have some process by which new electric cars, or some of the new electric cars, would have the capability. And then at some point you say, okay, we've got enough. We have 100. Like I was saying, a megawatt, 100, but then you allow somewhere plugged in, you might want 150 or 200. So it's not huge numbers. 40,000 or so cars on the island. A couple of hundred, you could have a megawatt power. But if they're just bought on the basis of these are electric vehicles and they're clean, which is all good, then you're not going to have a V to G capable fleet when you have 200 or 300 cars on the island. So I will talk about some of the preconditions for being able to do this, so I can answer that a little bit more systematically.
Sunny.
I guess.
Oh, I apologize.
Okay.
No, please continue.
The other question is, like in the places where they have done it, who is it that actually took the initiative and did it? Obviously, there has to be participating car owners, but who went out and made it happen, and how did it happen?
Well, so the Nissan Technical Center, that was Nissan itself.
Yeah.
They wanted to try it out with their fleet. They had vehicles there that were just sitting around, after testing or service. I mean, it's kind of an easy case. You just plug them into the charger instead of having them on the lot. In the case of the electric utility, or not utility, electric, the utility in Copenhagen, that's a municipal utility, so it's a municipality.
Yeah.
They said, we want to have electric vehicles, and we want you to try this V to G system. So that was more or less a directive. I mean, they said, we'd like you to do this, but you know what that means. In the Delaware project, that was partly interest from the university in doing it, but also is just a research project with BMW. So it was funded by partly Anuvi actually funded part of that, and Google.org funded part of it. So it was several kind of research organizations that started it. That's not typical, but for demonstration, it might be the typical kind of thing.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Sunny.
Just to go back to the vehicle to grid discharging. So on those charging stations where you saw all the cars,
Yes.
would that be one of those discharging stations? Could
Yes.
that be converted into that?
The ones that were in the pictures were all already converted.
Okay.
They had that capability.
So that is available on the market today?
Well, so the AC charging station, that is a market item you can buy. Like I mentioned, it's about $1,500.
Okay. Because from the presentation we had from our deputy minister for the province, he indicated that the charging systems they put in don't have that capability.
I don't know.
Across the province, but you could do it at home.
Very few that have it, yeah.
But it could be done. So like, if you had all those cars there at that charging station,
Yes,
and the demand went up and you wanted to discharge them,
yes.
that could be done, or it
It
is
definitely
done
could be done, but you need to have a charging station that works that way and a car that works
in
that
a car that works that way. So you're more apt to do that at home than on a,
way. Well, a lot of what people
Commercial?
are doing are fleets.
are they?
So they're
With their
business
fleets?
vehicles they use during the day.
Okay.
You could have again, start out with a demonstration where you could have an employer, maybe it's some employer is interested in the, electric system, whether it's a regulated utility or, a crown company or whatever. They could have cars where they've got charging at work, and then those employees also get that type of charger at home. Then you've got almost, 24 hours of capacity. So there's several ways to do it, but you can't just buy the charging station. You make sure the charging station and the car are capable of doing that.
Thanks.
To get revenue, you also have to have an aggregator who knows how to sensibly put this on the grid and make it a valuable service.
Okay.
So in a sense, if you just say, is there a charging station available? Yeah, there is, but it isn't going to do all this without the other pieces.
Thank you.
I think you're good to go again.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that's looking at the business model and the different entities. Just briefly, you can make the economics work better by picking the market, as I said before. Onboard charger, much lower cost. Bidirectional, I mean, people say, well, let's just, charge only when there's plenty of power, and that's good. We want to do that if there's not other things to do. But these services where you can discharge sometimes and charge other times have way more value, more than 10 times the value. So it's more work to get it bidirectional, vehicle to grid power, flow of power, but the value is way higher. And higher power per car, whether you're talking about going from 7 kilowatts to 10 or 7 to 20, or you're talking about a school bus instead of a car, higher power is more revenue. It's more the power than the energy, it's more the charging speed than the size of the battery that affects the revenue. And consistent plugging in, so you want an incentive that's based on plugging in more or talking to the driver or something. So these are ways to improve the economics.
And I see a question from Steve Howard.
So the extra cost of an electric bus versus a diesel bus or propane bus or whatever other kind of bus there is, when you're comparing those two, I mean, there's the bus operator, whether it's the Department of Education or transit system or whatever it is, but there's also the benefit that comes straight to the utility. Are you aware of any models where the utility themselves have bought into, like, say, some buses that they would connect to the grid, and instead of spending money on diesel generators or sending money off island and be powered, we could be subsidizing our transit fleet or our school buses?
An example of that would be the largest utility in the state of Virginia, or actually it's the Commonwealth of Virginia. They are, over the next 10 years, I think, going to replace the entire school bus fleet in the state, which is thousands of school buses. And the model there is that the utility is buying the batteries and the charging system, and the school bus pays the remaining cost of the electric buses. So when you do that, it's not actually much incremental cost for the school bus. And of course, then the utility wants to discharge those batteries and charge them at times that meet their needs for peak power or balancing or whatever. So yes, there's a perfect example of just what you said, where the utility purchased part of the school buses, but it's the part that's the electrically valuable part.
So instead of, say, spending $50 to $100 million on a diesel generator, you could take that and subsidize a fleet of school buses if you had access to the batteries through an aggregator.
Right, you have to have all the pieces working, but yes, right. Now, it's exactly which is more lower cost and so forth. If they're paying for the whole battery and the charging system, maybe it's not actually saving money over that diesel gen set. It's definitely saving the school district money. Maybe they should be paying for half instead of all of it. I mean, you can twiddle with the way the program is set up. But right, there's certainly a potential for saving the school district money and reducing the cost of providing those services, right? Yeah.
Narrowing that gap of how much you have to get to before you see a payback.
Right, and I'm talking about the cost for a demo project versus a small, versus production. When you're buying all the school buses in the state of Virginia, you're at those numbers where you start getting the cost down a lot more for the buses, the batteries, the charging stations. So definitely, I would expect you would have savings on all sides in that kind of a program.
Steve? Good? Fantastic. Further questions? Back to you, Dr. Kempton.
So I've answered this to some extent already, but which car manufacturers are participating in this? BMW participated in demonstrations, actually spent a lot of money to enable us to do demonstrations. They also had one at PG&E, California electric utility. That was just controlled charging rather than V2G and controlled charging. Honda has developed a pre-commercial vehicle. The idea is to sell it, and they say that they'll sell all their EVs with V2G built in. what year does that become available? I'm not sure. They could be interested in a demonstration project. That we'd have to have a discussion about that, but they have done some demonstrations. Lion Electric are commercially selling V2G school buses, school and trip buses. I guess not the kind of ones with the payment part and all that, but they've got several different types of bus models which they're selling, again, with V2G built in. And then Renault is not selling in North America to my knowledge, but they're mass producing a V2G capable vehicle. They have, again, prototypes are selling in the hundreds now. They plan to go to full production of electric vehicles with V2G. And some OEMs have done detailed studies of the effect. They have warranty policies already. They generally, if they've looked at it carefully, they've decided it's not a problem. If they haven't looked at it carefully, they're assuming it is a problem. So when you talk to OEMs, ask them whether they've actually done a study before you get their opinion on whether it's a problem or not. So policy approach, to answer that question that was raised before, if PEI is interested in doing this, there's really two separate steps. One is regulatory changes to allow EVs to be connected the way solar systems are now. So there's standards, there's regulations. You can't just throw anything on the system and start pushing power onto the grid. You have to meet certain standards. Those standards aren't appropriate for electric vehicles. So there need to be regulatory changes to allow this to happen at all. This is called interconnection. Utilities think about this a lot, because it affects the safety of their line workers and it affects the quality of the power. The second one is some kind of incentive for demonstration programs to develop an understanding by different parties, including the utilities and the relevant ministries. And this is a good time to do it, because if you wait until EVs are coming in at a rate of 5,000 a year, and you don't have all the other stuff in place, you're going to get a lot of EVs, which is great, but you're not going to get V2G because none of them are going to be compatible with this type of system. So, you could have a demo of 20 vehicles or up to 100 vehicles or something like that doing grid services. It's going to be more expensive per vehicle, and maybe it's just fleets. Maybe it's a electric company or a ministry or a company that has an interest in this type of thing, have one of their fleets, which could be a little bit more controlled demonstration. But you want to have a variety of drivers, and you want to try different grid services and see what the revenue is, see what kind of problems there are. There's always problems in demo. We don't have to wait for a mass-produced vehicle. Could be some school buses, or it could just be EVs which have a modification so they can do it. Maybe at fairly high cost, $5,000 per vehicle, let's say, could be the cost. But you have a limited number of vehicles and somebody needs the vehicles, they should pay for the vehicles. Some other entity maybe pays for the incremental cost. So that's a way to do it. I have a little bit more detail, but there's these two separate steps. Regulatory changes to allow it, and then incentive for demonstration program.
Question from Steve.
You mentioned a pilot of 20 to 100 vehicles just now. Is there any minimum number you'd want to have in a pilot to make it effective with the aggregation software?
Well, because there's a cost to sort of going out and getting things set up and all that, if it's like 5 vehicles, it's sort of hard. It's going to be harder to get companies engaged. The people who would do the modifications, the charging station. Well, the charging station is kind of off the shelf, so it's easier to buy 2 of those. But even setting up the aggregator, like you've got to figure out what grid operator you're talking to, what's the signal work like, how do you support the cars. If it's less than 20, it starts being, is it really worth it? So that'd be a negotiation with the different companies who provide the different pieces of the demo, but that's why I said 20 as a low number rather than 2 or 5 or something.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Just today I got a response from a previous committee on climate change. We had a presentation from the Climate Secretariat. We had some questions, and I specifically asked about electric vehicles and the charging networks that we're looking at rolling out here, and are they going to be V2G capable? And the response I got was that the EV chargers currently being installed don't allow the discharging, and staff are not aware of any off-the-shelf systems that currently allow for that. There are off-the-shelf systems that currently allow for that.
Yeah, I think that's a similar point also made earlier by the the other party. So you can buy a charger now and put it on the wall. It's like those ones you saw, the white unit on the wall, which is V2G capable. And there's an argument for maybe putting some of those in now so that they're there when you get to the point of wanting to do V2G. But without the other pieces, the car that's compatible with it and the aggregator, you won't have a working V2G system. So there's a way to interpret the statement, which is correct. But literally, is there a charger you can buy today that has V2G capabilities? Yes, there is. And it costs more than a non-V2G capability.
Steve?
What jurisdiction's furthest along in their path towards vehicle-to-grid integration?
Well, actually, the state of Delaware, where I live, has all the enabling laws that are required. And we have an operating system. You saw one of the photographs. It's a combination of stationary batteries and cars driving around and plugging in. That row of mini E's were operating into that jurisdiction, and it was totally allowed for what standards you needed to pass, how the net metering should work, and all that is already encoded in the law. It's surprisingly simple. In that case, it was like 2 or 3 paragraphs and some redefinitions of what a distributed energy resource are and things like that. So that's totally clear in the law. We worked with the local utility, made sure they got the things they needed. I had to work a bit with the standards organizations to make some modifications there, so there were standards that jurisdictions could adopt as being correct. So I'd say Delaware is maybe the furthest along. California is going through that process right now. They want to do more. They want to not just say this standard is okay, but they want to define testing protocols and so forth. It's probably going to take them a couple of years before they really have it laid out. Although they say they really want to do V2G, they are going to do it in a way where we had, in Delaware, in a small state, we had, 10 or 12 people involved in discussions. California, trying to adopt this standard, there's a phone conference, and the call-in list has something like 90 or 100 people on it, from all different constituencies. So needless to say, it takes a little bit longer. P has more Delaware size than California size, so you probably have an advantage in that way. But in Denmark, I'd say it's pretty far along. There's some things that the system operator just says, you're not quite following the rules, but that's okay, because we know what you're doing is safe, and we know we're actually getting the services you say you're saying, because we've gone out and metered it. So Denmark is pretty far along, but to get things fully sort of legally legit, they have to go to INSO-E, which is the whole European grid standards organization, and that'll take another 2 years.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. You already kind of covered from a policy and regulatory perspective what we'd have to do to enable this here. Would there be any sort of infrastructure improvements needed to get us started? Other than the chargers themselves, obviously.
No, you'd want to be sure there's good internet service at the points where all those chargers are.
To communicate with the aggregate server.
Right.
Not the smart grid.
Right. That's right. Yeah, that, let me think, see if I missed anything. No, that's really it. We just deliberately designed the system so it can go in many different kinds of electrical systems. You're not relying on some type of smart system already there.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. I think you kind of touch on it here a little bit as well, but is there any specific changes that we might need to make to a utilities rate structure and billing processes to monetize that?
So let me move on to the next slide if I may.
Yes, please.
Unless there's another question.
No, you're good.
So let's look at the second bullet. Bullet first here, net billing. So to specifically answer that question, right now if you look at the PEI regulations regarding net metering, in that case, it's for renewable energy resources. It's not for electric car. So there'd need to be some change to that, because otherwise, whenever you charge, you're paying for it, and when you discharge, you're not allowed to get net metering. So that's definitely financially losing. So there'd need to be some way of saying a storage resource, and it doesn't have to be only an EV, it could be batteries in the basement or whatever. If a storage resource behind a retail meter is providing two-way services, then you don't penalize it when it does backflow. That's not a compensation, it's just saying you get paid the same amount as you pay. Now, if there's an hourly net metering and a smart meter, then it's at the rate the meter is saying at that time. It's not necessarily the same rate, but we've got that in the Delaware code. It just took a couple of sentences. Second, that's equal payment charging and discharging, and it doesn't require smart. So that's the net billing part. Now, the other regulatory change is interconnection. How do you safely connect a mobile battery, where part of the system that you want to certify is moving around and plugging into different places at different times. All the ULC codes, which are more or less the same as the UL codes in the US, are meant for things that stay put. So it's a little bit more of a challenge to certify that a car, which has part of the safety components in it, is actually following all the codes it's supposed to. There's now an SAE standard, Society for Automotive Engineers, that's SAEJ 3072, which is we would need for AC connections. So there should be some way in the codes, I'm not sure if it would be law or whether it would be a ministry's guidelines for what codes are needed, but for DC chargers you would use the UL code 1741, that's already there, it makes sense. For AC charging, cars moving around, power conversions on the car, that's got to use an SAE standard, that has to be allowed. That was one of the biggest thing our utility in Delaware said. You got to put that in the code because otherwise we're legally required to use a standard that doesn't make sense, the UL standard. So that's so simple, but it's really important. In a sense, it protects the utility. And then sometimes there's a requirement that you have to say low voltage discharging can qualify for balancing payments. That's actually prohibited in some jurisdictions. I haven't looked at the code here carefully enough. But this is pretty simple. I mean, this is like a half a page of language, but it's needed. And then we can talk about, is there going to be a demonstration program? We're not going to do anything until these are mass produced or whatever. But just putting these changes in the code means it's possible. And that's something that the auto manufacturers are paying attention to. So when Honda and Lion Electric and these other companies say, should we put in the extra $300 to have a mass-produced V2G capable vehicle, they ask, and they sometimes ask me, where can we do this? Where can it make money? And I'd like to add PEI to that list. All that's needed for that is these code changes, which make it legal to do. Then, if that's available, then you probably want to get some demonstration program. The alternative would be wait until the cars are mass produced and worry about it then. But if you want to be out front in this, then some demonstration program would need to be incentivized in some way. Either there's some money from the province to do that, or maybe the utility is authorized or required to do that, incentivize that. And I've got some text here of how to do it, but basically this would be a small scale, again, sort of what are we talking, small 20 to 100 or whatever. Maybe I've got another one, 20 to 40 here. So you study what happens, you learn from that, and you figure out to what extent you can negotiate a deal with New Brunswick where that $15 per megawatt hour balancing fee is waived because, or part of it's waived because we've got X number of EVs or storage systems. And then yeah, we can go ahead with this and it's going to make sense financially. So without going into more details, some kind of incentive for a demonstration program is the next step after this regulatory possibility is done. So that's my presentation, just sort of acknowledge I'm not the only one who did this. So this is the first time there was any car being used for V2G. This is several power entities in our area with me on the left there, and Delmarva Power and PJM, the system operator, Pepco Holdings. And there's a bunch of people who did work to make all these systems work. That's the inside of the charging station I've been talking about that has V2G controls on it. So,
Steve Howard.
Thank you, Chair. So if you're looking at not necessarily just V2G batteries, but distributed batteries versus centralized batteries, if you were to have, say, a hurricane blow across and take power out for a week in a certain jurisdiction, which one of those two would be better suited to carrying on emergency services and...
Centralized batteries or distributed batteries is the
Yes.
question. Well, it's complicated. So the distributed batteries are out on all the different distribution feeders and substations. So if the failure was the lines that went to the centralized battery, and it doesn't do anything for you. But it's more complicated in a distributed system to make sure each of those systems can provide power without energizing the grid unexpectedly, the anti-islanding issue. So, and if you're looking at batteries in the basement versus the centralized battery is cheaper. If you're looking at EVs and V2G, where somebody bought the batteries already to drive, that's cheaper than the centralized battery. So I think it's a complicated answer to the question, depending on
Steve?
pieces.
Okay. So you could just throw a manual switch if you wanted and have that enabled so that you could plug your car in and
Sure.
keep your home going.
Transfer switch.
And you could make it even fancier if you wanted to, but you could go as simple as
Right.
that.
That would be to power the home, but not trying to repower one distribution feeder or whatever. Right. If you're just powering the home, right, with the transfer switch, which adds whatever, $1,000 in cost. But yes, that would be a way to do that.
Steve?
Yeah.
Thank you. So that was just led right into my next question, vehicle to home type scenario. You could do that on a much larger scale. Instead of vehicle to home, you could have, say, a government building with hundreds of cars parked in its parking lot, and you could smooth out the demand of that specific building by having a bunch of electric vehicles connected through this and just
Sure.
program it.
Now we're talking about grid connected, the grid's on,
Yes, yeah.
and we're using the vehicles to smooth that demand, so to reduce the demand
Of that
charge,
one site.
which was asked about previously. So definitely could be used in that way.
Of just the one site. Yeah.
Just the one set, one location.
Yeah,
Yes.
that building
Right.
that's connected. I read about a stadium in Amsterdam, I think it was, and when people come up there with their electric vehicles and plug in, when a game's on, the grid takes quite a hit because everything revs up in the stadium.
Yeah.
So everybody brings their electric vehicles, and the customers of the stadium provide the load balancing services.
Yes, right.
So
So
if that was
that's,
a
yeah, I
government
don't
building-
know very much about that case, but I think the number of cars is pretty small in Amsterdam that can do that. But maybe it's 10 or 20 or something. And I'm sure it was a good press release, but probably it had an effect, but not maybe a very large effect. Again, because there's not so many cars yet in Amsterdam that can do both discharging and charging. But totally valid point. That's the kind of thing that could happen. You'd want to demonstrate it with a small number of cars, which is, I'm guessing, what they did already, and then you provide some incentive, free parking at the game or whatever, if you drive your V2G capable car and discharge during the game. Yep.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Fleets that have control, that you're saying there's not very many consumers that have the cars that would bring it to the stadium and whatnot, but if it wasn't a stadium, if it was a government building with a bunch of government vehicles,
Right.
that you could say all these are going to be electric moving
Yes.
forward,
Right.
you could have a significant impact for...
Sure, and I think that's one way to do a demonstration. You have a government building or a utility building or some entity
School.
that has interest, school, with buses, school buses for sure. And then you provide, during work hours or game hours or whatever it is, their cars are there. There's been some incentive for a demonstration to get those cars V2G capable. And then maybe they go home or they go to another location and they can also provide the services there. So there's these two stages. One is like demonstration or fleet use or individual kind of businesses. And then at some point you want to have a subsidy for any consumer and it just starts becoming something that's available anywhere on the island.
Steve?
One last one for you, Willett. If everyone was amenable and agreeable and things moved along, what kind of time frame do you think it would take to, policy changes is up to us, but if we said, yes, we want to do a whole bunch of V2G here on Prince Edward Island, what kind of transition period would we be looking at before we had any sort of serious impact?
Before it has serious impact. Well, that's a little bit harder. I'm not sure how to answer that because it depends on the uptake rate. But you could start having demonstration fleets, I think, at the end of the calendar year, in terms of if you're getting some of the stuff provided by us, it'll take us a little bit of time to get things spec'd out. But as far as, to ask when it starts having an impact on the electric system, you'd have to ask how soon do you get larger numbers of those vehicles. So if it's school buses, those are kind of ready to go from Lion Electric, for example. If you're talking cars, we would have to specify a retrofit that would be ready. And then when is Honda actually going to have production vehicles? I'm not sure. So really, to have significant impacts, you need, I think, commercial vehicles with V2G built in. Either as an option or as a standard thing. So that's right now, that's Lion Electric and Honda coming, but maybe not until 22 or something. Or, retrofit vehicles.
Go over to Ola.
Oh, you described the EV-to-net as really a load balancing, pointing out that the car and battery is a net consumer and electricity doesn't actually produce anything.
Right.
So I take it the value really is that we have a utility producing huge amount of electricity, and the value is that you have this relatively small amount of power that is instantly available.
Yes.
Either way.
Right.
So
that's right.
So the value doesn't really translate into cost per kilowatt hour. In that
That's right,
sense.
exactly.
But I was wondering to what extent there's a value, whether it's a value, just on an hourly basis, or how does it relate to the value, for instance, of taking power generated during the day by solar panels for use at night?
Right.
But obviously it wouldn't, for instance, if you have a week of good wind, they wouldn't be able to take the storage from that week for use in the next week. It's a fairly short-term thing.
Yeah.
But do you have any?
I mean, yeah, more or less that's correct. I mean, maybe you'd say, well, okay, we have all this wind this week. Everybody says they would need at least, just simple models, say everybody says I need at least 50% of my battery. So they say, well, we're going to push that up to 75%. And we're going to hold it. That's going to be our target for the next week. And then the week after there's not as much wind, we'll move our target down to 50%. You still have to be above what the customer said they needed, but but generally, that's a little bit weird, and yes, you're right, it's the short-term, hourly, 3 hours, 5 minutes, those are the kind of most valuable markets, right? And the easiest to do.
Yeah.
Yes. And you're saying it's not per kilowatt hour, which is absolutely correct. More or less it's per kilowatt. So, and you say...
It's capacity.
We have 10, my car has 10 kilowatts, and I add up with others with this aggregator. And so I get paid for 10 kilowatts. It's a capacity payment. And that might be a balancing service where it's a pretty high fee per kilowatt. Just as give some representative numbers, in PJM it's about $25 per megawatt now per hour. It's not per megawatt hour, but I've got a megawatt available. I can push up or down a megawatt, and they'll pay me $25 for that megawatt per hour, even if they don't do anything. It's the ability
just to have it.
Yeah. They may move me up and down a lot. They might not do anything at all. I still get the same $25.
Okay.
Spending reserves is similar, but they just discharge. They never ask me to charge. And so there, the payments might be $8 or $10 an hour per megawatt per hour. And I might go 2 months and they never call me. But when they call me, it's really essential because some other part of the system has failed. So those are both dollars per megawatt available per hour, and they dispatch it when they want to. And then the third system would actually be in kilowatt hours, and that's the one that Travis was referring to. It's expensive right now. My rate is high. I'll discharge and get credited at that high rate. Later, the rate is low. I'll charge at the low rate and fill up my battery. There, it's actually a cents per kilowatt hour that you're getting.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Will. I really appreciate this today. I mean, when we talk about 79 electric vehicles and PEI, we're not there, but mass production is coming, and we will be there. But I think it's more important for government to be leading the way and setting the example first, so that we build up that capacity and the infrastructure so that down the road it is more affordable kind of thing. So you start looking at your government fleet at a government building, or your buses and that type of thing. Or maybe you're incentivizing delivery fleets or something like that, versus this one-off house by house where, the vehicles, I don't even know if it was 79, how many would be capable right now? Probably not. But I think as the committee, I guess that our role is to push government with our recommendations to say, we're not waiting for it to be feasible per person. Let's set the example, put the infrastructure there so that when things do happen, and maybe there's an agreement with, somebody that's supplying this, if we're putting in that infrastructure, then we're paying the full cost of it, but then privately it's reduced, we can do with that. But I think it's just
I totally agree with your statement.
incumbent on our, regulation, legislation-wise, I guess that's part of our committee to recommend that too, so I just want to say thank you.
Fantastic.
Pleasure.
Minister Trivers.
Thank you, Chair. And along the lines of what Sid was saying, the mandate of our committee is to look at how we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we have 1.2 megatons of CO2 per year, by 2030. So, this presentation, of course, is fantastic. I think it's hard to go wrong with more electric vehicles and, of course, a vehicle-to-grid system that provides incentives for people to go and purchase electric vehicles. But I guess my question is, how does a vehicle-to-grid system really contribute to the reduction in greenhouse gases, like CO2 equivalent emissions? Is it does it really come back to the utility? Because, here on Prince Edward Island, we have locally produced energy, but we also have a large amount of energy that we produce off-island. And the way the mechanisms for calculating the credit for your greenhouse gas emissions, if the utility is located outside the province, they're sort of the ones that get the credit for it. So that's kind of the context of the question. But also, how can vehicle-to-grid actually help us achieve this 1.2 megatons of CO2 equivalents by 2030?
Pretty complicated question.
I know that. I'm asking the big one here.
But of course, I think we need to separate the kind of EVs versus the V2G part.
Right.
So on the EV part, I should say, because the on-island generation is primarily carbon-free, every time you add an EV and take out a diesel or a gasoline vehicle,
right,
there's a benefit there for sure. So that's just EVs without the V2G part.
Right.
Now maybe the V2G part motivates more people to get EVs or get them earlier, or some fleets may want to do it. But that's just on the EV side. And of course, there's more wind coming on already. It's already planned. I understand a 30 megawatt and a 40 megawatt one after that wind. And the wind resource here is amazing. It's really incredible. I don't know if you get credit for that if you already almost all your generation's off island. But in essence, if you put more wind on, your EVs are then higher fraction is non-carbon sources. You're pulling less power across the interconnection. So whether it's accounted for correctly or not, that is definitely reducing CO2 emissions that the population of the island causes by driving. Right? So then the other question is, how does V2G affect this? So if you just had an all fossil generation mix, no wind farms, no solar on the island, because you're moving back and forth, you would benefit. It's not just wind that needs balancing, also fossil generators do, not as much, but they still need it. So you could bring in V2G and you'd be using batteries to balance, whereas otherwise you'd be using a natural gas plant to balance, probably. So you're actually turning off a natural gas plant that you don't need anymore because you've got storage to do that. So by doing V2G, you've got that direct impact of not needing to use thermal units for balancing. And when New Brunswick does balancing for the island, that's probably also, it's not just the megawatt hours of bulk power, but the balancing is also CO2 generating. I don't know the mix completely, but I'm sure it's mostly or all fossil. So those are savings you get from V2G. And then there's the additional possibility of doing more wind, because now you've got this storage. As more EVs are bought, you're able to have more storage coming on the system. You don't even have to do anything. And then that means the wind, you can say, oh, hey, we can go to 80% wind, or 20% solar, and 70% wind, or whatever. So there's that kind of overall growth of the electric generation mix that also is affected by having low-cost storage.
And would it be fair to say it also helps to create an economic case for bringing more electric vehicles online? Can make the
if the business, like they talked about the business model and stuff, if you can get that worked out, then there's an economic case in addition to whatever carbon case there would be.
Which could potentially be a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions that are accounted for on Prince Edward Island. Minister Trivers?
No, thank you very much. I know that's a bit of an unfair question to ask you, but thank you. That was a great response. And one of the things we have to do on PEI, outside of our renewable local energy production, is we do have to supplement that, and in the past it's been with a diesel generator. So in terms of being able to provide that load from electric vehicle batteries, in those cases, that would definitely have a direct impact on our GHG. So that sparked that. And then to the point of the chair as well, the business model saying, I can reduce the cost and increase the rate of return on investment on my electric vehicle if I can get money back and use it to supplement load balancing. So that's great. That answered my question. Thank you very much.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Related to what the minister just asked there's another part to what our mandate is here, not just to hit those targets, but to fully cost it as well.
Yes.
We've got a transportation strategy that says let's get a whole bunch of, let's electrify our transportation. We've got an energy strategy that says let's electrify everything, because of what you mentioned about all of our greenhouse gas emissions are dumped onto New Brunswick through our electric grid. But as we do that, we drive up demand, and that demand comes with a significant cost. So it definitely plays into that whole mix of things of, if indeed we want to electrify transport, we have to find a cost-effective way to do it. But for a question for Willett, we have a climate leadership. Our transportation strategy, as I just mentioned, is calling for electrification of transport. So do you feel, in your opinion, that it would be wise for us to incentivize the kinds of vehicles that are vehicle-to-grid capable at this point, kind of separately from normal electric vehicles, as a cost-effective way of dealing with their demand issues that might arise?
Well, I wouldn't presume to speak for PEI, but to get the various carbon reductions that we've just been discussing, and to get to the point where you've got mass-produced vehicles and this is lower cost than not doing it, I think it makes sense to have an incentive for electric vehicles, and then maybe, I don't know if it's a payment or a tax credit or a mandate or whatever, but to have an additional incentive for V2G capable vehicles. So there's a benefit to electric vehicles. You don't want to say you can't buy an electric vehicle unless it's V2G capable. But there is some additional cost, even on a mass-produced basis, for the V2G part. And I think it makes sense to start getting charging stations and vehicles available and on island, which can do that, even if they're not all hooked up in the beginning, to be able to actually dispatch power and so forth. So one way to do that, to answer your question, is to have a tiered incentive, and there are probably other ways to do it as well.
Recognizing that we are now 2 hours in, if we have final questions, yes,
One
Steve.
tiny little, it's more of a point of clarity just on your presentation. Some of the terminology, you're using AC and DC chargers in your terminology, and I think everyone here might be more familiar with level 1 or level 2 and level 3. So
right.
Level 2 would be your AC charger, and level 3 would be your DC chargers.
That would be typical, right.
As what's in your presentation.
There's several companies now, including Nuvve, which are providing a level 3 AC charger.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is wildly less expensive. than, for sort of 50 to 100 kilowatt level. But yeah, I mean, yes, it's electrical terminology, and yes, it sort of corresponds to level 2 versus level 3, but you're putting alternating current into the car, and there's a conversion in the car. That's AC charging. With DC charging, you're putting direct current into the car. It may go more or less directly to the battery. There's not systems on the car that are intervening much except safety relays and such. So, but that means you have all this additional cost off the car. That's why it's more expensive.
Any other final pressing questions? Given the amount of questions we've asked you, Dr. Kempton, I think you can
Perfectly
imagine
fine.
our committee is very interested in this topic.
Well, that's great.
On
Appreciate
behalf
that.
of the Special Committee on Climate Change, I want to thank you so much for taking the time and the effort to travel to Prince Edward Island to present to us.
My
We will
pleasure.
take a very short recess to allow you to pack up, and we will reconvene in just a couple of moments. Thank you. bringing the meeting back to order. Thank you very much, everybody. So we will continue on with a review of correspondence since the last meeting. Clerk, would you mind providing us with an update?
Sure. There's just, I think, 3 rather thick memoranda in front of you. One is just the letters of invitation the committee sent out since last meeting, and it includes some other correspondence sent by the committee as well. That's number 1. Number 2 is follow-up information that the Eco-Fiscal Commission provided subsequent to their meeting with the committee, including their final report, which came out in November. That's the thickest of the 3. And then the last one is follow-up information from the Deputy Minister of Environment, Water and Climate Change to answer some of the questions that were brought up in the October meeting with Todd Dupuy and Aaron Taylor here to answer the committee's questions. And also a submission from Angèle Gamble, just that she sent of her own volition to the committee regarding ATVs and climate change. All of this material was previously circulated by email. I'm just giving it to you now for your files, so you have a hard copy.
Fantastic, that's great. And then moving on to a review of scheduling. Clerk, would you mind terribly giving us an update on our next events?
Sure. The committee has another meeting scheduled for next Thursday, January 23rd. The witness presenting there will be Laura Berry. She's going to talk about citizens' engagement. She works for an organization called the Climate Mobilization. She will be appearing via Skype. Still an outside possibility we could have another witness for that meeting, but as of right now, it's only Ms. Berry. Following that, January 30th, we've got a meeting kind of in development. I've got the Environment and Climate Change Canada has indicated that they can have officials speak to us about the greenhouse gas inventory on that day. And possibly another witness, Andrew Swingler from UPI School of Sustainable Design Engineering, to talk about energy storage. But there's no notice out for that day yet, but I think you can expect one pretty soon.
And on that point, I will not be able to attend either of those next 2 meetings. So if it's the pleasure of the committee to go ahead, I would ask that we would choose another chair for those 2 meetings. Would anyone like to put forward a nomination for chair for that meeting? For those 2 meetings, excuse me, the 23rd and the 30th.
And the dates again, the chair?
Would be January 23rd and January 30th.
Steve, can you be interested, Jay?
I would hope that somebody that has 2 representatives remaining here of the original committee would put forward somebody to be a chair, so that one of the original committee members is still present on this side of things.
Are you on committee, yeah?
I'm on committee, I'm not sure if I'm going to be here then, but why can't we select that day?
You absolutely could if it is the pleasure of the committee. It might be nice to have the opportunity for the person to prepare ahead of time. Is there a preference one way or another?
Select that day would be fine, yeah.
Okay.
Then you know who's going to be here for sure, because they'll be there that day. Yeah.
Fantastic. Then we will leave it at that. And did we have any further scheduling that you wanted to give an update on?
Well, I can just say, I think we might talk about this a little bit further along, but of course there's the 4 meetings on the road in February. Notices are out for those, February 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th. That's that.
You don't notice that you requested there.
No further discussion on this particular item? Sydney?
Thank you. So those meetings are full, just clarification on what those meetings, they're full committee meetings with the Hansard and transcripts and all that. That's a full meeting, correct?
It's a full regular meeting in most senses, but in other locations we can't live stream.
No.
We don't have the ability to do that, but Hansard will be there, a transcript will be produced, there'll be audio recorded.
So no difference than just going over to the Angus MacLean building when the house is in session, so to speak?
Pretty similar to that,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
So,
Ola?
does the public does not have a chance to have input at those meetings either? It's similar, they will just be able to listen.
Do you want to answer this? Or just,
I will let you answer that. Clerk.
Well, I think that's what's coming up on the committee's discussion, the next couple of items on the
Okay.
agenda, but
Yeah.
there are some previous decisions that the committee and discussion about that the committee wants the public to be able to have more input on those on-road meetings. And that's not to say that the public can never have input at a meeting here. Any member of the public can make it known to the committee. They would like to present to the committee, and then the committee simply has to decide yes or no, and then schedule them accordingly, and it could be done right here too.
How?
Isn't that the purpose of going on the road is to have public engagement?
So that's actually one of our next
Okay.
agenda items to
Okay.
discuss, if that's all right? Thank you. Do we have any new business that we want to add to the agenda? Minister?
Well, thank you, Chair. No, just based on that excellent presentation we had today, I thought it might be good to maybe just quickly come up with a few potential recommendations. I know we're going to be coming up with a meeting later on, but one thought that occurred to me was that if we were going to pilot a vehicle-to-grid program in the province, Summerside Electric with their...
Excuse me,
Yes?
Minister, I apologize, but before we make recommendations, the committee would generally go into camera to do that.
Right. And
So is that a new business item, or are you suggesting that we
Well,
set a meeting to discuss?
I do have one new business item, and then just wanted to make sure we don't lose track of, potential recommendations while I can wait for in-camera for those. But the one for the scheduling, though, I was thinking Summerside Electric, if there's any utility that could pilot this on the island, they seem obvious, with all the advancement and innovation they have there. And, they've got a lot of the infrastructure that could lend itself well to a vehicle-to-grid. So along those lines, it might be worthwhile to consider scheduling somebody from Summerside Electric to come in and speak to the committee and see what the feasibility of some of the things we're talking about are in terms of vehicle-to-grid. Maybe hear about what they're doing with their smart grid technologies. Now, I know that being a couple of members here from Summerside, you may be more hooked into what's going on with Summerside Electric, but I wanted to throw that out on the floor for discussion, just to see what you think.
Comments on that in particular? Sunny?
Mr. Trivers got his hand up ahead of me. I was going to say that very thing, and I certainly support that we bring, that was a wonderful announcement on Tuesday. And if we could bring them in here, and I'd even like to make a motion that they come in, because, we need to hear from islanders. Yes, we've heard from some experts, and we're going to have a Skype presentation, but we need to hear from islanders how it's affecting, how climate change is going to be affected on PEI as well. So, if it needs a motion, I'd certainly make a motion that we invite Summerside in sooner rather than later.
Ready for the question, or do we have discussion on it? Trivers?
I just think it's important, we let them know what we want them to present on. And so I'm thinking, Sonny said, it's their experience on the ground, on the front line with real life. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but they do have some smart metering going on. They're doing some thermal power storage, distributed thermal storage. They've also got a solar farm, that was a big announcement, along with some battery power storage. I don't know how far do we want to go with their presentation, but I think vehicle to grid, and whether that's something they could pilot in the future would be one of the key presentations, along with what they've learned on the ground with what they're doing, some of their current initiatives. That's what I would suggest.
Yeah, I would agree with that. An overview of their experience so far and lessons learned, as well as touching on the potential for vehicle to grid integration. Is that how?
We present to them. So this vehicle to grid, it sounds like you want us to bring it up to them, to ask them if they are open to that idea. Is that not what you're saying?
Minister Trivers?
That's correct, and with the assumption that they know what vehicle to grid is, and they would be able to tell us whether, given their current initiatives and their workload and resources, whether a vehicle to grid pilot would be something they would even consider in the near future. Because I'm thinking they are the obvious choice if we were going to do a vehicle to grid pilot on the island. In fact, given that they are really the only completely on-island utility with their power, that they would be a really good choice. That's where I'm going with that. I want to find out from them whether vehicle to grid could be on their roadmap, assuming they understand what it is. And we might have to, in a letter to them, indicate, some resources as to what we mean when we say vehicle to grid as well.
That was my comment, was like, we want to hear from them what they have accomplished, but if you want to do that, Minister, then yeah, we need to make them aware that we're going to question them on that, so they can, they're prepared to, they can't, if it's going to cost a whole bunch of money, that, we can't put them on the spot that they're going to spend a whole bunch of money here in committee, right?
Steve?
Yeah, so vehicle to grid is something that the City of Summerside's explored in the past for powering up their fire hall and things like that. They've got it in their economic development plan to roll out those kinds of things. However, they've signed a massive agreement with Samsung, and we probably won't be able to talk about a lot of what we want them to talk to us about. So there's that issue. Although at that announcement that we were at yesterday, they did indicate that Phase 3 would make Summerside the most advanced smart city in North America, and would involve a lot of infrastructure relating to electric vehicles. So one could put two and two together there and assume that it is part of their plan, but whether they can reveal and talk to any of that, I very much doubt.
Minister Trivers?
And your point taken, Hal and Steve, maybe it's best left up to a recommendation from the committee on that front, that for example, I'm not saying this is the recommendation because I know we'll talk about that in camera, but that the department contact the City of Summerside to talk about a vehicle to grid pilot in the future and pursue that with them, or something along those lines, as opposed to bringing them in to talk about vehicle to grid. That said, on the non-vehicle to grid front, I do support the motion from Sunny to bring in Summerside to talk about what they've learned with their current initiatives, and any challenges or lessons on the front line with what they're doing on their innovative electric front.
And just for clarification, committee, if we could be specific in who exactly you would like me to send that request to?
It's the engineer.
Be able to offer.
Very good.
Thank you so much. Steve?
Has Greg not been into, not this committee, but another committee already presenting on all the things they've done and plan to do?
Well,
Minister?
I didn't do a lot of research into that. I asked the clerk during the break if he just in his personal recollection, and within the last like 10 years or so, he's definitely been in once, but I believe it was probably at least a few years ago, so it probably would be worthwhile. But again, in the letter to Summerside Electric, that's something we could broach. If you feel there's more that you could add, we would like to have you in. Yeah, we don't want to waste his time with the same information. I agree 100%. Yeah.
Question?
I do agree.
Huh?
We actually did an on-site in Summerside a few years ago. But I mean, there's been a lot of advancements since then, and I'd be more than happy to see them. And again, I'm glad we're back to inviting them in and letting them present to us, as opposed to us making recommendations to them, because our job is to make recommendations to the Legislative Assembly. So, okay.
Fantastic. Are we ready for the question on this one? Are we in favor of the motion?
Yes.
Yes, supportive?
Yes.
Sydney?
Sorry. So we're up in Summerside on February 6th. Do we want them to come in here and present, or do we want to go meet them and see it before our meeting at 6:30 on February 6th? I just throw that out there, but if you prefer it's a public presentation, or are we going up there to see what they're doing? That's another option.
Steve?
Just throw out there that I won't be around for that one. I would love to be present for that presentation that comes from the electric department in the City of Summerside.
Just joking.
You've been there, done that.
So back to the original motion, would we like to invite the City of Summerside to give a presentation on lessons learned from their electrifying initiative?
Right.
Yes.
Do you think that still goes with their original mandate, Chair?
Of making costed recommendations on how we will reach our targets?
That's right.
I suppose that is up for debate of the committee. I would feel yes, but I'm open to thoughts on that.
I think it is. I mean, let's see what they're doing, explore a little bit and
I think the point could be made that as we continue to electrify, there's an awful lot of homes that have the potential to stop burning oil as a main source of heating, and 20% of our emissions come from homes, so I think that would be a fair case. Sunny, did you have something?
Correct me if I'm wrong, there was a number of people at that announcement on Tuesday. Did they not say that it would be equivalent to taking 3,500 cars off PEI highways?
I believe 3,500?
I don't remember the number.
But it was.
Whatever it was, but so that would fall underneath this mandate, would it not? Like that in itself, so.
Point that the minister is making earlier, the way our greenhouse gas inventory is calculated on Prince Edward Island, emissions that come from electricity specifically would be credited to New Brunswick. However, there are spin-offs that would be associated with that that would apply to areas that are calculated within our jurisdiction. I think both are incredibly important. Steve?
Just the cars off the road definitely. But the equivalent in clean energy generation for our electrical grid doesn't do us anything for our actual greenhouse gas inventory.
Sydney?
At the risk of pushing this out longer, should we wait to find out exactly what we're doing at the public meeting in Summerside on the 6th before we decide if we're inviting Summerside into here? Because if we're inviting people from the public in to present, it might be a good starting point to have them present to us in Summerside.
It is my understanding that currently we have Adam Fennick booked to present in Summerside, so I would think those would be two very separate discussions, but I am curious what the committee feels.
Okay, fine, let's just vote, bring them in.
Are we comfortable to have the vote on this? Are we ready to decide if we would like to bring in the city of Summerside? Is that a...
On a specific date?
We would send an email to, or a letter to find out their availability. So are we in favor of?
That's one more question.
Yes.
If they are available on February is it the 6th?
Yes.
Could we not do two presentations in Summerside or multiple?
So to Steve's point, he would not be present for that. and
Oh,
had
he won't
asked
be
me
there.
Specifically if he
Oh.
could be present for that discussion.
Okay.
Are we ready to vote on this? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Done. Thank you. Any new business?
Chair, if I could.
Of course, then.
Could I ask the minister a question?
If the minister is willing to entertain a question.
Okay. I asked the chair. There was a recent announcement there in December, and it was a wonderful announcement about the electronic fare system for a couple of new smaller buses in the city of Charlottetown through the transit system, which is wonderful organization and company. Now, was there any thought, the province is putting in money and the feds are putting in money, was there any thought for an electric bus? Were you part of that, or is that totally under infrastructure?
Minister, do you feel that this question falls within the scope of the committee?
No, I mean, regardless of the scope of the committee, actually, I don't know that information. It really is more of a transportation infrastructure energy one.
Part of our mandate is transportation, right? You know, electrifying transportation on PEI, so that's why I just asked the question. Okay, thank you.
The city, I think, Sonny.
Thank you.
It was the city, right?
Yeah, the city, but the funding is provincial and federal funding.
Oh, was it?
3 municipalities, Charlottetown, Stratford, Cornwall. So I mean, great initiative. I'm just wondering if there's any thought of electric.
Try and get that information for you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Do we have any new business?
Information was the economic case for buying the buses they did versus electric. Is that what you're gonna, was that what that was?
I don't know, I think I wanted to talk to the member after the meeting to clarify, but
And I've lost
I think
it.
he's just saying, were electric buses considered?
Exactly.
That's it?
Yeah,
I'm,
but were they considered? That's all I'm asking.
Do we have any new business? Ola.
But it's not really new business. I was just commenting that Finnick, his presentation, I think I've had been there. It's sort of how our island is going to become 3 or more in the near future. So I'm just saying it might be good to have another presentation that sort of present a little more like Summerside, what you can actually do about it.
But
That was
Steve
my
won't be
thought.
present at that
Okay,
meeting.
yeah.
He's requested to be.
Yeah,
present
and not
at this
necessarily
meeting,
Summerside, but somebody. That's all.
Thank you. So, for the next section of the meeting, we do have a number of items that we have suggested would be useful to discuss in camera. Could I get a motion to go in camera? Moved by Hal. Do I need a vote on that, clerk? If you are in favor, could you please signify by saying aye? Aye. All opposed? Nope. Then I will move us into camera.